What is a shader, by the way? A shader is a calculation of how to output materials and how those materials will interact with light in your scene. If we click the name of the shader, we can choose from a long list of other shaders. We aren't going to cover them all, and you won't use very many of them. This shader doesn't have many options, but the principal BSDF has a lot more settings because it can do a lot more stuff. Remember how we added the second material? Well, the first material is the material currently assigned to the plane by default. When a material is placed in the first slot, it gets assigned to the entire object. To change materials, we can go into edit mode, select the portion of the mesh we want to assign the second material to, select the material, and then press assign. We could select different parts of the mesh and assign different materials to different parts in this way. We can select the material slot and press minus to remove the slot. The removed material will still be available to add to objects later until we close Blender. We can double click on the material in the slot or down here and rename it. I'll rename it to subscribe, just as a little reminder for you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future tutorials. This is as far as we're going to go right here. We are now heading over to the shader editor. The best way to get there is to change to the shaded workspace at the top. Before we go any further, there's an add-on in Blender called Node Wrangler that you will want to have turned on pretty much all of the time. Go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and search for Node Wrangler. Check the box next to it to activate it. This add-on enables a lot of things you can do with the nodes. It should really just be incorporated into Blender by default, but for technical reasons it's not. If your workspace isn't exactly like mine, don't worry. The important things are you should have a 3D viewport set to material preview mode, and you should have this big area known as the shader editor. The properties panel should be over here on the side. Let's just cover a few basic things about the shader editor. In the top left, we see a drop-down box that says Object. This means the shader editor is set to work on object materials, which is what we want. But we can change this to work on shading of the world, which is the background of the scene, the sky, etc. This is how you could add an HDR image to light your scene or to serve as a background. Up here we have some of the same controls for the materials here. It shows our material slots and the materials assigned to them. Now let's talk about nodes. We have the principled BSDF node assigned to this material. This large node is the principled BSDF, with all the same options we saw in the materials panel. But you will always have this material output node as well. You can select a node and press G to move it around, or just click and drag it. Many of the same shortcuts of Blender work in the shader editor. If I have a node selected, Shift-D duplicates it. Shift-A is how we add a new node, and X deletes a node. The material output node is the final output of whatever information your nodes create. It has 3 channels. I mentioned these earlier. The principled BSDF is a surface shader, so it's plugged into the surface input of this final output node. All information in node editors flows from the left to the right. So you put information into the nodes on the left side, the nodes do something with that information, and put out new information on the right. Because the material output node is the final output where all the nodes end, it only has inputs on the left side. These dots for inputs and outputs are called sockets. The principled BSDF node has a whole bunch of input sockets on the left, but only one output socket on the right. You'll notice the sockets are different colors. A green socket represents complete shader information. If a node has a green output on it, it is considered a shader, meaning it can be an end product that can be plugged into the final output node. You'll often hear node and shader used interchangeably, but technically only some nodes, the nodes with green outputs, are actually shaders. Yellow sockets indicate color information. So this base color, for example, we could plug any sort of color information into this, and the socket will recognize it as color. This could be a color image. The gray sockets are value inputs. These could be numerical values of any kind, but often range between 0 and 1. Many of these settings on the BSDF have values that range from 0 to 1. 0 means there's none of the effect, and 1 is the effect is turned all the way up. Let's look at roughness as an example. Roughness is how rough a material surface is, and it affects the reflection of light. 0 would be a completely smooth surface, which is unrealistic for most materials. 1 would be very rough. You can actually click this value and type in a value higher than 1 if you want to. These gray sockets can also accept black and white or grayscale values. Why are black and white or grayscale images important? Well, it's unlikely that you'll want a material to be exactly the same roughness everywhere. So these 0 to 1 values allow us to map values to different areas of the material using black and white or grayscale coloring. Here's an example of a roughness map that can be plugged into this socket. 0 is represented by black, 1 is represented by white, and everything in between is represented by a shade of gray. The darker the gray, the closer it is to 0, so the lower the effect will data to map out roughness values over the object. So that's what the gray sockets are. They're value inputs that can also be mapped with grayscale images. This concept will be important in both procedural and PBR texturing that we cover in part 2. The last color here is purple. Purple sockets deal with vector information, which is information that either tells Blender where to map something or where to move something. It's hard to explain, but you'll see this mostly with normal maps and material mapping, which we will cover soon. For the most part, you usually plug outputs into light-colored input sockets. So green always needs to go to green, purple into purple, etc. This is not 100% always the case with yellows and grays. Sometimes you have a black and white output that you're going to use in a color socket and vice versa. But yellows are looking for color information, and grays won't recognize color information other than black, white, and grayscale. So the principled BSDF shader in Blender has a lot of settings, probably more than any other because it does a lot of things. This was only added to Blender a few years ago, and before you actually had to combine a lot of nodes to be able to do what this node can do by itself. It's important enough to go over a lot of these settings. I'll be honest, some of them I've never used and I'm not going to be able to adequately explain. But base color is pretty self-explanatory. It's the starting color of the material without any effects like reflectiveness or roughness added to it. The next 3 are for subsurface scattering, which is what happens to light that penetrates the surface and scatters underneath it. The best example of this is human skin. When light hits skin, some of it goes through and scatters underneath, giving it a pinkish hue. The subsurface scattering settings can replicate this effect. Metallic. I'll try to explain this as best I can. Materials that are truly metal have a reflective property, but also have their own color. So it's different than, say, a glass mirror. There are 2 basic workflows for shading that you'll see, and they are a metalness workflow and a specular workflow. Some artists choose to use the metallic input and some the specular, depending on the material and their personal preferences. These are different from each other, but are both ways of giving a material reflective properties. Roughness we kind of covered, but it's how rough the surface is on a very tiny, nearly microscopic level, and affects the reflection. Paper has a high roughness value. On a microscopic level, it is not smooth, and that roughness will make it not reflect light as well. Most glass will have a very low roughness, and even at the microscopic level is very smooth. Anisotropic, sheen, and clear coat are some advanced characteristics you can give a material that we aren't going to cover right now. Transmission is how much light is allowed to pass through the material rather than be reflected off of it. Emission is light that the material actually emits from itself. You can give the emitted light its own color and strength. You can actually use this to have objects light your scene or for a variety of effects. If you're emitting light from a material, it's usually going to drown out any other settings you have up here. So this is usually used by itself. There's also an emission shader that only does emission if you want to use that instead. Alpha is transparency. Whenever you see the word alpha in pretty much any graphic software, it's referring to the transparent quality. 1 is no transparency, a little backwards it seems, and 0 is full transparency. That's just how alpha values work. Of course, this and all other settings can be mapped to an object, so you could have parts of your material transparent and parts not transparent. You would use a grayscale map to do this. The normal input is for a normal map. Normal maps are a way to fake depth and shadows in your material without actually changing the geometry of the mesh. They are very useful. Here's an image of a surface with no normal map, and here's an image with the normal map. No difference in the actual mesh, just using normal data to fake the look of depth and height. Alright, so let's look at some other node options in the Blender shader editor. To add a node in the shader editor, you press Shift-A and you get this menu. The nodes are all categorized into groups, and there are quite a few of them. Often you'll know what node you're looking for and can search for it by name in the search field. You'll see a category called shader. Remember, a shader is a node with a finished output ready to be plugged into the output node. Some of them are for surfaces, some are for volume. You can also go over here in the shader properties and see the options for different shaders. Most of them are very simple, don't have a lot of inputs, or are designed to do one very specific thing, like the glass shader. The principle of BSDF is so useful that it's almost always what you start with. The mix shader can be added to combine two shaders together. I will duplicate this shader and show you how to mix two shaders. I'll give one a red base color and one a blue base color for demonstration. To connect sockets, you can drag the output socket of one node over to the input socket of another. And when it's connected, this line will appear to show the path of the information. There are a few ways to disconnect a shader, and one of them is to just click the output connection, drag it off, and let go. I've got a faster way as one of my tips at the end of this video.
Sorry, the webcam froze. That's the first time I have landed at Zayance. Oh my gosh, it was scary. So I understand now that the previous time I saw the, what is it, a dock? Space station, whatever it is, I flew into it not knowing what it was, and I even tried shooting it down. Now I know it's the green thing. Let's just head back to Lave. This is the furthest I've come in this game since 1991 or 2, when I bought my A500. Oh dear. I don't think I even bought anything. How do you sell? Is that it? Can I buy a ton of computers now? Alright, let's go back to Lave. Trying to do the launch. You don't need permission. Now I've got to readjust. I've been playing Elite 2 all day. No yes, there's a hyperspace. I don't care if any pirates come around, I'm just gonna avoid them. Hyperspace. Huh? Beyond range. What does that mean? Double clicked it. That's where we're heading, right? I didn't buy any petrol. Oh, there's no save states. Oh, I'm gonna have to do it again and buy petrol. What if I could... How do you use the telephone in this game? Do I have a docking computer? Well, if I've done it once, I should be able to do it twice.
Value down here, and whenever you see the W value in shading, it's an animation factor. It can make the texture move over time. Change the W and the texture moves. You can keyframe this value to have the texture be animated, which is let's do that. Shift A and we find the color ramp under Converter. For nodes you use repeatedly, I've got some tips to add them to the editor faster at the end of this video. So let's drop the color ramp in between the Musgrave texture and the principal shader.
And do I push C?
Notice this now has a gray socket into a gray socket on the left, and a yellow socket into a yellow socket on the right. It's almost like it was meant to be. The color ramp now acts as a gradient control for the transitioning between black and white areas in the texture node. If we move the white closer to the black, it shortens the transitional fade between black and white on the texture.
It's a pity that there's no options to switch off the pirates.
Select the white, then use the color selector here.
Where would there wouldn't be a game? Oh.
And lastly, since the color ramp does output RGB colors, we can change the colors to actually output a colored texture if we want. I'll quickly show you.
Is the space station yellow now?
Voronoi is a useful texture that you can get a lot of cool looks out of.
If you want to learn Python for a career in data science, IT, or engineering, then you need the complete Python Bootcamp course.
There's no S.
These videos are practice exercises to help you run create a career-ready portfolio with advanced techniques taught by top-rated instructors. Anytime, anywhere learning, take fitness towards that. So get this course and code on.
Music, sound effects, footage, and templates. And my favorite part is that one subscription covers all of your projects on any platform. Never deal with licensing ever again. Save time, money, and impress your clients with Artist.io.
Bricks or blocky textures. Lots of settings on this one. The wave texture allows you to add bands or rings. Here's the really interesting part. These textures can be used as inputs for other textures. I could plug the Voronoi into the wave scale and get this. I could plug the Musgrave into the scale and get this. Or plug the Voronoi into the Musgrave and get something like this. There are endless combinations of these you can use to get different effects. And there are countless Blender tutorials out there that show you different ways to play around with all of this. Another way to mix and combine texturing effects or colors is using the Mix RGB node. The Mix RGB node in Blender acts just like the Mix shader we looked at earlier, but instead of being for shader outputs, it's for color, including grayscale color values. I'll add a Mix RGB node. I'll plug a Musgrave texture into one yellow socket and a Voronoi texture into another. Again, we have this factor setting that controls how much of each one we get. For this one, we also have a lot of different blending modes. If you've used other graphic software like Photoshop or whatever, you've probably seen these before. They are different formulas for how to blend colors together. Not going to go into a lot of detail here, but the default mix might give you a very different effect than add or multiply. And depending on what you're going for, you may use different blend modes. For demonstration, I'm going to add a wave texture and plug it into the factor to control how these two textures are mixed together. You see the bands from the wave texture have separated where the Musgrave and Voronoi show up. Of course, adding a color ramp in here can give us even more control. Or we could add color to this. We've used one texture node as a map for how to combine two other texture nodes. And this is a very simple setup. There are endless combinations on how you can mix and match textures to get all sorts of procedural effects, and again, there are tons of tutorials on different ways to do it. So now let's talk about mapping textures onto an object. With this simple texture, it isn't that big of a deal, but it will be with a more complicated one, and when we get into PBR texturing in part 2. To add a texture mapping setup to this, we actually have to add two nodes. The first is a mapping node. This node's purple vector output will plug into the purple vector input here. And we immediately notice that the entire texture disappears. This node is a control node with all the mapping controls, but it doesn't even know where to start without the help of another node, the texture coordinate node. The texture coordinate node has a bunch of different ways that the texture can be told how to be mapped in Blender. Different uses may require different outputs here. Generally, for procedural things, object is going to be your best bet. But you see this has adjusted the material based on the size of the object. So an alternative could be the generated, which is kind of just like the default. When we get to PBR stuff, where we will actually be using images that may need to be placed on very specific parts of the mesh, as well as multiple images which need to be placed in the exact same way, we will use UV. So this mapping node gives us all sorts of controls over where this texture is mapped on the object. We can change the location along all three axes. This is only a two-dimensional object, so some of this isn't as important. We can rotate the material, and we can scale the material along each of these three axes. One main point on nodes we should mention here is an output can go into many inputs. But an input can only have one connection going into it. Often we'll use the same mapping setup and feed it into multiple different nodes, but if we try to feed two nodes at
Oh crap. Where'd it go? What the hell? What screen's it on? Oh. Weird. Okay. What's the password? Same. And I've renamed the file to Control End. Control End? No. I've renamed it Control Alt Page Down. Control Alt Page Down. What I'm gonna do, this is my 3DFX emulator. thanks to this video here, that I lost Windows 10. I can't remember why anymore, but I had to do a complete reinstall. This Windows 10 machine is running DOS, Windows 98, Windows XP, Commodore 64, Workbench 1.3, Workbench 3.1. It's running an Apple II emulator. There's just, yeah, just one operating system is running a dozen or more. So what we want to do, Control Alt page down, I want to load a CD. Can we do that? Okay, so what I've done is I've saved this folder has got all my homemade cartoons and cartoon characters and silly logos and stuff in it, and that's 8 gig. This has got all Macromedia software and software from the 90s, early 2000s, and this one's Macromedia 12-in-1. So fingers crossed. It's come up as an audio CD. What have I done wrong? I've never done this before. I must have done it before, because how else would I have installed Need for Speed? Yeah, but that's not a CD. It's a DVD image that I'm trying to load. Control Alt page down. What if I mount to K? Host K. Might have to make it a no, it's trying to play it as a CD. How do you load? Oh, okay, it says CD-ROM. Disk. No, that's a floppy disk. You'll have to make it a CD-ROM. No problem. Hockey docky. It has to be under 700 megabytes, of course. could mean so much to me. Didn't know that you could be so one with me. Looking back, I see what I was meant to say. Dreamweaver? Just a guess. pill. Fireworks. FWW 400 02666. Samsung Galaxy. No idea. It was just found out in the woods, the body. So I talked to the turns herself onto fire. This actually, no, this is before I invented this one before. fire brigade can't get onto the property because she's barricaded it off through an
There was a minor problem while registering me. This may be due to busy servers at my home site. But don't worry. You can attempt to register me again now or at any time later by right-clicking on me and selecting registration. If you attempt to register again now and this fails, you may want to wait until a little later to register me when the servers aren't too busy.